In a time of great tribulation and hopelessness for the people of Israel, there lived a man named Ezekiel. Israel was in ruins. The Temple of Jerusalem had been destroyed, and its people were exiled in Babylon, far from their homeland and feeling abandoned by their God. In this dark scenario, Ezekiel emerged as a beacon of hope. He was a prophet, chosen by God to bring messages of renewal and redemption to his people. From a young age, Ezekiel felt the divine presence intensely and undeniably, having powerful visions that revealed the future and God's will. His life was marked by moments of deep spiritual connection, where he was taken to states of transcendental revelation. However, none of these experiences was as impactful as the one that occurred in the Valley of Dry Bones. This vision in particular stood out for its intensity and transformative power. It not only reaffirmed Ezekiel's prophetic mission, but also symbolized God's infinite ability to bring life and hope even in the most desperate circumstances. With his unwavering faith and devotion, Ezekiel became an instrument of transformation, capable of inspiring his people to believe again in the possibility of renewal and redemption. Israel was devastated, plunged into a deep abyss of despair and desolation. The majestic Temple of Jerusalem, once the center of the people's faith and identity, had been reduced to rubble. Its imposing walls, which once resonated with songs and prayers, were now just silent ruins, symbols of a lost era. Many Israelites had been torn from their homes and forced into exile in distant and oppressive Babylon. There in foreign lands they felt like trees uprooted, without sustenance and without hope. The exile was not just a physical separation from their homeland, but a profound spiritual rupture. Far from Zion and their God, the people of Israel were engulfed in endless anguish. Hopelessness permeated the hearts of every man, woman, and child, creating a collective feeling of abandonment and forgetfulness. The stories and traditions that once united the people now seemed like mere memories of an unreachable past. Many wondered if God was still with them, or if he had left them at the mercy of their enemies. This feeling of abandonment was so deep that even divine promises seemed to have dissipated like smoke in the wind. Life in Babylon was a constant reminder of their downfall, a daily life marked by the absence of everything sacred to them. In the midst of this darkness, the faith of many weakened and the people of Israel longed for a sign, a promise that they could somehow be restored and lifted from the ashes of their desolation. One morning, while Ezekiel was in deep prayer seeking the presence and guidance of God, he was suddenly enveloped by a supernatural sensation. The Spirit of the Lord took him, transporting him in a vision to a vast valley. This was no ordinary valley, but a place haunted by a sepulchral silence and palpable desolation. As his eyes adjusted to the scene before him, Ezekiel saw that the ground was completely covered with dry bones, scattered everywhere. The magnitude of this vision was overwhelming. The bones were countless, each a silent testament to lives long lost and forgotten. The scene undeniably spoke of death and abandonment. There were no signs of life, no greenery, no flowers, just the yellowed white of bones dried by time and the elements. Ezekiel felt the weight of sadness and despair in the air, as if each bone carried a story of pain and desolation. The silence was deafening, a quiet so profound it seemed to press against his ears. The only sound that disturbed this mortal calm was the wind blowing through the bones, producing an eerie whisper, like the lament of the dead. Each gust of wind lifted small clouds of dust, which danced over the bones before settling again. Ezekiel walked through the valley with a feeling of reverence and awe, aware that he was in the presence of something sacred and terrible. He could almost hear the echoes of the lives that once animated those bones, feel the weight of the fate that had reduced so many to nothing more than scattered skeletons. This place was a monument to the fragility of life and the inexorable march of time. The vision was both fascinating and horrific, a powerful representation of the state of Israel, devastated, hopeless, waiting for a miracle. Ezekiel knew he was not there by chance. God had a message for him, and for the entire people of Israel, a revelation that would change the course of their lives forever. God then asked Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these bones live?" The question echoed through the silent valley like a celestial thunder, making Ezekiel shudder. It was a question loaded with meaning and expectation, a query that tested not only Ezekiel's faith, but also his understanding of divine power. Ezekiel, with his heart pounding and his mind racing with thoughts, looked at the valley covered with dry bones. Each bone seemed to scream the impossibility of life, a constant reminder of death and destruction. He knew that, humanly speaking, the idea that those bones could live again was absurd. But Ezekiel also knew the greatness of God, the creator of the universe, who made man from the dust of the earth and breathed into him the breath of life. With reverence and uncertainty, Ezekiel answered, "Only you know, O Lord." This response, though simple, was loaded with depth and humility. Ezekiel did not try to offer a solution or an explanation. He acknowledged his own limitation and surrendered to divine wisdom. The humility in his response reflected a pure and unwavering faith, an understanding that only God had the power to transform death into life. He knew he was facing a mystery that transcended human understanding, a mystery that could only be unraveled by God's power. As Ezekiel uttered these words, he felt a deep connection with the divine. It was as if he were aligning his spirit with God's purpose, opening himself to be a channel of divine will. He understood that the restoration God was about to perform was not only physical but also spiritual. Those dry bones were a metaphor for the state of Israel, a spiritually dead people without hope. Ezekiel's response, therefore, was not just an expression of faith but also an act of total surrender to God's will, a surrender that prepared the ground for the miracle to come. While the echo of his response still resonated through the valley, Ezekiel felt a wave of expectation growing within him. He knew God was about to reveal something extraordinary, something that transcended human logic. He waited with an open heart and a soul in tune with the Spirit of the Lord, ready to witness the manifestation of divine power that could make dry bones live and transform desolation into hope. God commanded Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones, telling them to hear the word of the Lord. It was a bold command, challenging the visible reality and summoning the power of the divine. With a mixture of reverence and determination, Ezekiel raised his voice, his powerful and clear prayer breaking the sepulchral silence of the valley. "Hear the word of the Lord," he cried, and his words echoed like thunder, reverberating through the bones that covered the barren ground. At first, nothing happened. The valley remained still, silent. But then suddenly, a tremendous sound swept through the valley like the roar of an earthquake, deep and resonant. It was as if the earth itself was responding to the divine call. The ground began to tremble under Ezekiel's feet, and he saw the bones starting to move, dragging themselves across the ground in a tumult of noise and movement. They joined together with astonishing precision, fitting together like pieces of a giant puzzle, forming skeleton after skeleton. Ezekiel watched in awe, his heart beating fast with a mix of fear and admiration. The valley, once quiet and full of death, now pulsed with a strange and powerful energy. Tendons began to wrap around the bones, weaving with intricate complexity. Flesh and skin grew rapidly, covering the skeletons and forming complete bodies. It was like watching creation in reverse, a divine dance of regeneration. Each body that formed was a testimony to God's creative power, a masterpiece of restoration. Ezekiel saw faces taking shape, hands and feet gaining form, muscles stretching under the newly formed skin. However, despite the impressive transformation, something was still missing. The figures were complete but remained motionless, inert. There was no life in them. The valley was now filled with whole bodies, perfectly formed, but without the vital breath that would animate them. It was a sight both glorious and unsettling, an army of flesh statues waiting for the Creator's final touch. Ezekiel understood that the physical restoration was only part of the miracle. The spirit of life, the divine breath, still needed to be granted. As the prophet contemplated the scene, he felt a new wave of divine instructions rising within him, preparing him for the next step in God's grand revelation. Ezekiel knew he was about to witness something even more extraordinary, a true rebirth that would transform inert flesh into a living army, full of purpose and power. Then God commanded Ezekiel to prophesy to the Spirit, saying, "Thus says the Lord God, Come from the four winds, O Spirit, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live." This was a call of immeasurable power, a direct invocation to the breath of life that only God could grant. Ezekiel, feeling the weight and grandeur of the moment, raised his voice again, now filled with an authority that could only come from the divine. He called to the four winds, summoning the spirit of life from all directions, a call that echoed through the valley and beyond. "Come from the four winds, O Spirit," he proclaimed, his voice carrying the divine command through the silent space, "and breathe upon these slain, that they may live." The atmosphere seemed electrified, charged with a palpable expectation. The wind began to blow, gentle at first but growing in intensity, as if the very elements were responding to the Creator's command. From every corner of the world the wind gathered, converging on the valley, swirling and whirling in a vortex of spiritual power. Ezekiel watched with wide eyes as the Spirit of God, invisible but undeniable, moved among the inert bodies. It was as if an electric current passed through them, a vital energy that brought movement and color to the flesh that had been still and pale. Immediately the bodies began to stir. Chests rose with the first breath of life, eyes opened shining with new vigor. The figures, which had been mere shells, now pulsed with life infused by the divine breath. One by one the bodies stood up, shaking off the dust of death and assuming postures of strength and purpose. Ezekiel, his heart overflowing with awe, saw an army forming before his eyes. It was not just any group, but a vast and numerous army. A mass of people rising as one, each of them restored and revitalized by God's Spirit. The valley, once a place of desolation and death, was now full of life and energy. Each individual, a living witness to the Lord's restorative power, stood with a new mission, a new hope. The army was an impressive sight, a force of life and faith extending as far as Ezekiel could see. God had fulfilled his promise in a glorious and overwhelming way. The Spirit had breathed upon the dead and they lived. Ezekiel, now witness to an unprecedented miracle, understood the depth of the divine message. No matter how devastating the situation, how hopeless the circumstance, God had the power to restore, renew, and bring life where there had been only death. This vision was not just a promise for Israel, but an eternal testimony of God's infinite ability to turn the impossible into reality. God explained to Ezekiel that these bones represented the whole house of Israel. The vision was a powerful and deeply symbolic metaphor, illustrating the spiritual state of a people who had lost everything they held dear. The people of Israel, in the midst of exile and destruction, were saying that their bones were dry and their hope had vanished. They saw themselves as the living dead, wandering without purpose or promise, prisoners of an existence marked by loss and despair. Words of discouragement echoed among them, a constant reminder of their seemingly irremediable situation. But God, in his infinite mercy and power, promised something extraordinary. He affirmed that he would open the graves of his people, not just literally but metaphorically. Each grave represented a prison of hopelessness, a place where dreams had been buried. God promised to bring them out of these tombs of despair, freeing them from the chains of anguish and apathy. This promise was not only about a physical return to the land of Israel, but about a deep and comprehensive spiritual renewal. God declared that he would bring them back to the land of Israel, the place of their roots and ancestral promises. This land, which seemed so distant and unattainable, would once again be the home where they would flourish. The return to the land was not just a geographic movement, but a return to identity, faith, and God's promise. He was restoring the covenant, reaffirming his eternal commitment to his people. Moreover, God promised something even deeper. He would put his Spirit in them. This was the essence of the divine promise. It would not just be a return to normal life, but a complete transformation. God's Spirit, the vital and creative force, would be infused in them, renewing not only their bodies but also their souls. They would live again, not just as individuals but as a revitalized community, an entire nation resurrected by God's power. With this renewal, they would recognize that the Lord had fulfilled his promise. The fulfillment of this prophecy would be undeniable proof of God's power and faithfulness. There would be no doubt that it was God's hand that had guided them back to life. The nation of Israel, once devastated and disheartened, would rise with new hope, a new purpose, and a renewed faith. They would understand that despite all adversities, God had never abandoned them. He had remained faithful, always present, waiting for the right moment to restore and renew. This powerful vision and God's explanation were not just for Ezekiel and his time. They echoed through generations, an eternal message of hope and renewal. Even in the most desperate situations, there is always the possibility of rebirth by God's will and power. The valley of dry bones became a symbol that life and hope can be restored, that dreams can be resurrected, and that faith in God can bring new life to any spiritual desert. This powerful vision of Ezekiel in the valley of dry bones was not just a sign of physical restoration, but also a deep and comprehensive spiritual renewal. It symbolized God's limitless ability to transform death into life, to turn despair into hope. Each bone that joined, each tendon that formed, was a silent witness to the miracle of divine recreation. This vision was not only a demonstration of God's power, but an eternal reminder of his unfailing mercy and love. By sharing this vision, Ezekiel brought a message of hope that resonated deeply in the hearts of the people of Israel. In the midst of desolation and exile, they saw themselves as those dry bones, devoid of life and purpose. But through Ezekiel's words, they were reminded that God had not abandoned them. Even in the most desperate situations, when everything seemed lost, God's will could restore hope and life. This vision was a powerful message that no matter how severe the circumstances, divine intervention could bring renewal. The image of the dry bones coming to life was not just a metaphor for the physical return from exile, but a symbol of a spiritual resurrection. It told the people that their lives could be renewed, that their souls could be revitalized no matter how deep their wounds. Ezekiel's message brought comfort to the afflicted and disheartened people of Israel. It was a call to renew faith, an exhortation to believe again in the Lord's transformative power. By understanding that God had the power to make dry bones live, they were encouraged to believe that their own lives could also be transformed. Ezekiel, with his vision, reaffirmed God's sovereignty and his commitment to his people. He showed that restoration was not just a matter of returning to the land, but experiencing a complete renewal of the spirit. This vision became a beacon of hope, a testimony that even in the deepest darkness God's light could shine, bringing life and hope where there had only been death and desolation. The story of Ezekiel and the Valley of Dry Bones continues to inspire generations, transcending time and circumstances. It is an eternal beacon of hope, a powerful testimony that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of rebirth and renewal through faith and God's grace. This tale of spiritual transformation echoes through the ages, inviting each individual to believe in the Lord's redemptive power, capable of turning dry bones into abundant life. Ezekiel's message is a constant reminder that faith in God can overcome any adversity. It speaks of the power of the human spirit, when allied with divine faith, to rise from the ashes and find new life. It is a call to all to never lose hope, to always believe that with God everything is possible. The story of Ezekiel is not just an ancient narrative, but a living, pulsating lesson that continues to touch hearts and minds, offering comfort and inspiration. Each time this story is told, it renews the promise that no matter how desolate the valley of our lives, God's breath can bring a rebirth. It is an invitation to embrace faith with renewed vigor, to trust in the divine plan, and to believe that restoration is always possible. If you've reached this point, it's because you are special to God, so comment, "I believe in the mercy of the Lord." Subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends. Until the next video.